Good morning to all of you. My name is Tiki Pang. I am currently a visiting professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Up until 4 months ago, before I joined the LKY school, I was Director of Research Policy at the World Health Organization based in Geneva, Switzerland, where I was there for around about 13 years, but now sort of returned to academia. Without further ado, I think we have a really exciting session this morning with three very eminent speakers. What I particularly like about this session and the collection of topics and speakers is I think it addresses what Tom repeatedly said over the last day or two, and that is this need to break down barriers across disciplines. So I think we're very fortunate to have someone from a development background, someone from a health background, and finally an economist to give us their perspectives on from what in my background in health are three very, very important issues in the future. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Peter Timmer, who's really had a glittering career over the many years in food security. I'm not going to read his CV, but you can all read it in the brochure. He's Emeritus Professor of Development Studies at Harvard University and has done really very important work for governments such as the Indonesian government, the United States AID, as well as the agencies of the United Nations. So, Peter,
see if I can. Thank you very much. I'm going to say Tiki. We've introduced ourselves and discovered we have close friends in common. I might add that I am also an adjunct professor of economics here at the Crawford School, and so I'm especially pleased to be part of this new endeavor. It's a great honor and of course a challenge for me to deliver the first Fellows Address to our new society. The topic, food policy in Asia and the Pacific, is particularly appropriate to the multidisciplinary orientation of the society. And indeed, I think the topic is part of the very rationale for the formation of the society. Now, as Tom mentioned at that marvelous dinner last night, the society is already having its desired impact, at least on my own work. Steph Haggard, who's going to be speaking this afternoon, and I were in email communication early this morning, exchanging drafts of papers on similar topics, and I didn't know about his work, and he didn't know about my work because we write for different professions, different disciplines, and the society has brought us together, and that's very exciting. Whoa. That's not good. There. Food security in Asia and the Pacific presents an enormous paradox. At one level, huge progress has been made in the past half-century in bringing most of the population out of poverty and hunger. Food security has never really been at higher levels than it is now. There are large pockets of food insecure populations in the region, especially in South Asia, but the global food security community has largely turned its focus to sub-Saharan Africa. I know this because I advise the Agricultural Development Program at the Gates Foundation, and despite my very persuasive powers, I've not been able to get them to look at food security issues in East and Southeast Asia. They are focusing very heavily in sub-Saharan Africa and just recently in eastern India and Bangladesh. Because of rapid economic growth,
aggressive food price stabilization efforts, and safety net programs that deliver food to the poor, Asia and the Pacific are coping pretty well with their food security challenges. At the same time, food security strategies in the region are in almost total disarray. A fundamental disconnect exists between what most countries say their food security strategies are and what policies they are actually pursuing. The disconnect is most manifest with rice policy, where high prices for rice farmers are implemented to, in quotes, reduce poverty, when in fact virtually all of the poor and hungry in the region are net rice buyers and thus suffer more hunger and poverty from high rice prices. I accept and acknowledge Tom Compass's results for Vietnam that suggests that Vietnam, and I think probably southern China, may still be exceptions to this rule, but broadly in Asia, high rice prices mean more poverty. Only Singapore seems to have managed to avoid this Asian paradox, and that's no doubt because most of its consumers are relatively rich, and it has no rice farmers to woo politically. Now, the paper I promised to eventually produce for our new journal, I do know, Tom, that I owe you a paper, will seek to unravel this food security paradox in Asia and the Pacific. I hope to provide a brief, but what I think will be an essential overview of the food security dynamics, give a sense of history, scale, magnitudes, some of the issues. I want to try to explain those dynamics through a political economy lens. One of the reasons I'm particularly happy to get reacquainted with Steph and the work that he is doing, because he's a political scientist and I think of myself as an economist, and the political economy of these issues is going to be great fun to think through. I think we need a new approach to the political economy of food security, an approach that will incorporate what we are learning from behavioral economics, a lot of the regularities in behavior that are violations of at least some of the simple models of mainstream neoclassical economics. That paper's for the future. Today I want to look at the challenges from a broader and more historical perspective. The presentation today builds on the research and especially the teaching that I've done over the past several decades. This is going to be a broad historical perspective, if you like. We're looking at 30,000 feet. Rather than from the field. I want to talk about three transformations that have taken place over the last 200 years, broadly and globally, but which are underway very rapidly in Asia and in other developing regions as well. We have seen a structural transformation where the role of agriculture changes radically in the overall economy. The role of agriculture, as we'll see in a moment, falls quite sharply, even as agricultural output and productivity rises. We've seen an agricultural transformation take place on the farm, if you like, within the sector, even as agriculture becomes less important to the overall economy, the nature of agriculture and agricultural decision-making changes quite fundamentally. And we have seen a dietary transformation taking place, and I'll show you some examples of that. All three of these transformations are driven by very deep global forces of globalization and integration, market forces. But let me assure you that I understand that each one of these also is driven by highly specific local factors, resource endowments, policy environments, and the nature of the cultures. So first, some historical perspective on the structural transformation. I have to take 30 seconds to explain. Some of you are old friends here at the Crawford School and have never seen me give a PowerPoint presentation. This is my first one at ANU. I gave a talk at Stanford earlier, well, yeah, actually it was late last year, in the Food Security Environment series that the Gates Foundation sponsored on global food security and food policy. And unbeknownst to me in signing the contract with Stanford, given that it was funded by Gates, I was required to deliver a PowerPoint presentation, and I'd never given one in my life, and had basically resolved as a matter of principle that I never would. But Wally Falcon said, "Okay, Peter, you signed the contract, you're going to deliver a PowerPoint presentation." Fortunately, my older daughter is a graphic designer. She designed the original website for Walmart.com. She's now retired. But she said, "Hey, Daddy, I'll help. You tell me what you want to say, and I'll make a PowerPoint presentation for you." This is part of Anne's contribution to my ability to stand up in front of you and have pretty pictures, and perhaps even a story to tell. Now, this, if I had an hour, I'd take it to tell you about the structural transformation. I spent with a really, really good research assistant 2 years putting together the data that make up this picture. The red, does that work? Yes. The red is the share of the labor force that works in agriculture. And as you can see, this is the per capita income in logarithmic terms. So these are poor countries down here. These are rich countries up here. And here's, let's see if I can make, there's the zero line. So the share as countries get richer, both cross-sectionally, but there's from 1965 to the year 2000. So there's a time series going on here as well. As countries get richer, the share of the labor force declines in overall economic activity and approaches zero. In the United States, we have more lawyers than we have farmers now. We have more dry cleaner establishments than we have farm establishments. We are approaching the title of my monograph that came out of this, A World Without Agriculture. Of course, it's not a world without agriculture. The United States is producing more agricultural output, apart from the drought this year, than ever before. It's just that the rest of the economy has become so much bigger and dominates the world. The blue is the share of economic output produced by agriculture. And it starts out as high as 50 or 60% in very, very poor countries, and it too approaches zero as countries get rich. Again, not because agriculture loses out in total output, it's because it's a relative decline. What I am interested in is the green. It's got a negative coefficient, I put the zero up here, but this green is the difference in the two shares. It's what I call the gap. If you have 80% of your labor force in agriculture, but it only produces 40% of economic output, what's the problem? Labor productivity in agriculture is low. The gap would be 0.5. What's so interesting about this gap, and it takes either a very good eye or some reasonably fancy econometrics to say that this gap actually gets wider at the early stages as countries are moving rapidly into the industrialization process, and then the gap closes. We converge on equal labor productivity in agriculture and non-agriculture. And rich countries, in really truly rich countries, you no longer can tell by whether somebody is in agriculture or non-agriculture whether they are more likely to be poor or not. You integrate the financial markets, the labor markets, the product markets, and agriculture behaves economically like the rest of enterprises in the economy. And that, just somewhat facetiously, but I think revealingly, that's the world without agriculture. Agriculture doesn't look different. Okay. Let's see if I can make this. How do we raise agricultural productivity? Higher labor productivity, that's the basis on which higher living standards are established. We need to be productive as workers if we're going to be well off in economic terms. Higher labor productivity is both cause and effect of this structural transformation, and there are three ways to do it. One, and the one we'll no doubt talk about more over the coming sessions, is to use new technology, a green revolution, if you like, to produce more output for a given amount of labor. We can let agricultural workers migrate from the farm to the city. That's been historically a very important part of raising labor productivity because it actually raises incomes at both ends of the spectrum. The third one is one I want to focus on a little bit today because it suggests one way you can raise labor productivity in agriculture is to pay farmers more for what they produce. They don't produce more, you just pay them more for it, and in economic terms, that makes them more productive. This is a diagram that was originally invented by Vernon Rattan, University of Minnesota, but is now kept up by his colleague, Vern has passed away, but Phil Pardee, University of Minnesota, keeps up these data. This is a picture of changes in agricultural productivity over time by geographic region. And what you can see, here's Australia and New Zealand down here. This is output per worker, labor productivity, that's what I'm really interested in. On the vertical axis is output per hectare, the yield of the farms, if you like, and they're both in logarithmic terms. And what this shows us is there's more than one way to skin this cat. There's more than one way to raise agricultural productivity. Australia and New Zealand does it with lots and lots of land and not very much labor. In China and Japan, we see we use quite a bit of labor, very high yields on the land because land is scarce. So this is in a land abundant drive and tends to go out this way. In land scarce societies, we tend to go more vertically. In Europe, we're somewhere in between. If you're an advisor to the Gates Foundation, this is sub-Saharan Africa, very low productivity and not making very much progress over this period of time. I think it's pretty understandable why we might worry about sub-Saharan Africa. The result of increasing productivity, this is rice prices in real terms for over a century. And there's two things, it seems to me, that are going on here. One, the blue line or the yellow line, are trends of, statistical trends of real prices, and they've declined quite radically, between 1 and 2.5%, 1.6% per year. Pretty dramatic decrease in the real cost of rice. By the way, if you put wheat or corn, they look reasonably similar in trend. But also, I presume you'll be startled by just how much variability there is around. This is a highly unstable price. And if it's your basic foodstuff, you might worry a lot about spikes and collapses. Okay, I'm running behind. Let me go quickly. I actually took a third of the slides out before I started. I'm a rice guy. I want to talk quickly about the rice revolutions. We've had a revolution in demand, a revolution in supply, and a revolution in marketing. The kind of economies we live in are driven by demand, so I'll just talk very quickly about what's going on in demand. This is simply aggregate demand against aggregate income, demand for rice, and since about 1995, the global income elasticity of demand has been negative. So as incomes increase, rice demand falls. This is a wonderful picture that shows urban and rural for 3 different countries of what's happened at the household level, not aggregate looking at, but looking at actual household production data. Just remember 2 things. The level of rice consumption in rural areas on average is higher than in urban areas, but both of them have a decreasing trend with income. So the negative income elasticity is powerful, but also the difference between urban and rural is powerful. All you have to do to lower rice consumption in Asia is move a farmer to the city. They'll automatically be consuming less rice. Okay, so running this analysis forward, rice consumption, according to my best guess is rice consumption globally is going to start to fall in absolute terms by 2020 or perhaps as late as 2025. Maybe it'll be 2030, but the world's most important food staple crop is likely to have reduced consumption a generation from now, not more. It affects a lot of where we want to put our resources. What's the implications? Rice is increasingly the foodstuff of the poor. 40 years ago when I started working in Asia, rice was almost a luxury good for the poor. Now rice is the staple of the poor, and the upper 2 or 3 quintiles are increasingly moving away from rice. That has, as I suggested earlier, serious complications for food security if you're using high rice prices as your strategy for national food self-sufficiency. You're going to hurt the poor pretty significantly. Negative income elasticity, urban-rural migration, better connected farmers in Asia. All of this means rice consumption is going to fall. And with rice consumption falling, rice production as a share of output is going to fall as well, from 6.8% of output in the early 60s to less than 1% now. Rice, maybe those of you who are here from Asia think of rice as the most important food crop in Asia. That may be true, but it's not very important in economic terms any longer. I'll skip through. I do a lot of work on supermarket revolution. What are the challenges? The supermarket revolution's changing the nature of marketing. We're going to have real challenges to whether small farmers can stay in the marketing system just because of the safety demands, the transactions costs, and so on. The falling demand for rice with the insulation, Kim and I were both talking about this yesterday, the insulation of individual countries from the world market means we're probably going to end up with a very thin and unstable world rice market that is going to be a major challenge to the rice farmers in the rest of Asia. The structural, the agricultural, the dietary transformations can be very painful. It requires adjustments on the part of farmers, consumers, and even policymakers. history tells us it's the only way out. These transformations are the only sustainable way out of poverty. And what we need, we heard in the earlier session, we're going to need good government policies to speed the transitions and to mitigate the pain. That growing gap between incomes in agriculture and non-agriculture is a serious political challenge. And the only way we can do it is growth with equity and stability. So finally, I didn't talk about climate change, didn't talk about trade agreements. One of the things that we will want to talk about going forward is whether rice is going to escape the biofuel connection. Maize and ethanol and petroleum prices are now very tightly linked. Rice has escaped that. Is it going to continue to escape that? If we can financialize the rice market, are we going to get hooked in to that? I think that's going to be the big question going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Kelly Lee, who is Professor of Global Health at Simon Fraser University in Canada. She had a long and distinguished career at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Before that, I collaborated closely with her on many projects, and one of her major, most well-known outputs is a book actually called The World Health Organization, which in my view is one of the probably best analysis of that august organization. So please welcome Kelly.
Well, thank you, Tiki. Good morning to everyone. I'm delighted to be here to share with you in this launch. I think it's an incredibly important initiative for a number of reasons, which I'll go into during my talk. But I wanted to thank Tom for inviting me and his colleagues here at Crawford. I think, as I say, it's a very exciting endeavor. My role this morning is to try and give you a flavor of what the journal might be able to cover in its innovative approach to public policy, set out some of my ambitions and the critical issues that I think we could look at together, not just health people, but public policy people in general. And I want to try and encourage, I guess, a more informed and forward-looking public policy debate in the region, which I think is much needed. So I'd welcome your comments and advice on what I have to say in the next 15 minutes. Well, let's begin with some broad context, and I will be really using broad brushstrokes. I think in 15 minutes it's very hard to cover the health sector in one country, let alone a whole region. So I'm really going to just go through some broad ideas and try and stimulate some discussion around this. So health policy, for those who have to actually make it, let alone try and study what happens, leads, I think, you to immediately recognize that health lies far beyond the health sector. And I think it's nice that I'm on a panel with people working in other sectors, because health is one of those areas where you do have to look very broadly. Indeed, health policy often finds itself, however, quite low in the political process. Despite consuming quite a lot of public resources, in terms of political clout, health tends to be quite low down, especially at times when there is an economic crisis. So we have recession and bailouts and so on. These are the issues that are foremost in the minds of public policymakers. So health policy often gets short shrift in these contexts. So my ambition, I think, the first ambition anyway for this new journal, is to try and increase recognition that health matters to other policy domains. It's not just a health sector issue, it's not just a social policy issue. And to ignore this would be at our peril. So in the realm of economic policy, the focus has been and perhaps always will be on economic growth, although I hope Anne is able to change that. The region has been the doyen of economic growth, as we know, as this graph shows, and the region has outpaced the rest of the world over many decades in terms of growth. the World Economic League tables would be very different if Asia and the Pacific wasn't in them. So this first graph really just shows us that between 1950 or so and 1997, we have countries performing incredibly well. But Asian countries perform twice as well as the average of the rest of the world. Now, along the way, there have been bumps. The Asian economic crisis, as we remember, caused some setbacks, and it affected this trajectory. The current economic crisis is also obviously having an impact, although not as much as the rest of the world. But I think what we've learned from these crises is that markets are not really free. They need regulation to work properly, and I think this is the one lesson I think we've learned in the last few years. So I'll come back to the point about regulation later on in my talk. The other lesson I think we've learned from this period of bumpiness is that economic growth is not an end in itself, that growing and growing and growing for the sake of growing doesn't mean anything. If it's not sustainable, as we heard earlier this morning, if we choose to ignore other needs within society, then we grow increasingly towards disaster. And I think health is part of that equation as well, and I'd like to touch on that. So there has been some recognition of health issues within other policy areas. Most of that attention has been focused on communicable diseases, and particularly acute, potentially epidemic diseases. So, of course, in this region, we've had the trauma of SARS, and that rightfully did get a lot of attention because there was a lot that we didn't know about the disease, how fast it would spread, how many people would die, and so on. We had the same similar types of fears with pandemic influenza in 2009. Now, in retrospect, we know that they weren't quite as serious as initially feared. We see some statistics here. SARS had a relatively minor public health impact with about 900 deaths and 8,500 cases. Pandemic flu had a bigger impact, killed around 295,000 people worldwide, and had millions of cases, although we're unable to count that many. But when you put it beside a pandemic such as the 1918 pandemic, which calculations are up to 100 million people died, then you can see the relative size of these incidents. So it wasn't the mortality or the morbidity rates that frightened people in the region, but did initially. But what really, in the longer term, led to policy changes was really the economic impact. The region experienced sudden and very severe economic impacts in terms of travel, in terms of investment, in terms of just economic activity. Now, this was to prove to be quite short-lived, but it did leave lessons that health does matter to economies, and that if you ignore and you don't prepare for these incidences, then these impacts can have wider effects beyond the health sector. So that was a good lesson, and it's right and proper that we look at those issues and those quite frightening scenarios and prepare for them. I'm not certainly saying that they aren't important, but I think what has happened though is that we've taken the focus on those types of potential epidemics, and we've lost sight of some broader health issues that have what I call slow pandemics, those that have impacts that are likely to be even more severe than these outbreaks, but they're much slower moving, so we tend not to look at them as much, or we certainly don't prepare for them as much. The most visible in the Asian region, I guess, to think about is the lifestyle changes that we've seen being experienced, largely because of globalization. And we see this in many ways. This photo is just the, I suppose, the poster boy for public health people when they're talking about communicable diseases as McDonald's. So we always like to put a picture up, but it's much more complicated, of course, than one company selling burgers. If you look at and this is quite, it's a good segue to Peter's presentation, is to look at food. And Peter looked at food security in particular and how the region is, the region is interestingly still has the majority of undernourished people in the world. 578 million people are hungry and undernourished in the region, about 62% of the world's people that have this problem. But at the same time, we have a growing problem of overnutrition. And this is an interesting juxtaposition of images. One is what has traditionally been seen as the healthy Asian diet. I'm sure all of you still follow this, but a lot of people are not. And so you see, for example, you have the distribution of calories across different food groups, underpinned or scaffolded by daily physical activity. What you have on the right is really the change over time in one country, which is the Chinese diet, and how different choices are being made about consumption. So the ones I'd highlight would be, let's see if I can get this to work. Well, I'll just show you on the right-hand side here. You can see, for example, the vegetable consumption has gone down between 1982 and 2002. What has gone up is meat consumption, dairy consumption, and vegetable cooking oil. So what we're seeing there is quite a short period of time where the traditional diet is shifting. Now, this is not happening by itself. This is certainly, there's a complex number of reasons for this. But as Asia modernizes, it is also becoming prone to these modern lifestyles. And part of that is marketing, and part of that is corporations, a large part of that. Now, my area is around tobacco, and tobacco control in particular, and I'm interested in looking at how tobacco industry has operated to increase its role in emerging markets to survive. And so this is an interesting slide because it shows that the Asia and Pacific region is a critical one for an industry like the tobacco industry in terms of its long-term survival. And we've known this for some time, and we've observed the results. So here's just an example of how parts of the region will be targeted by certain industries. This is tobacco. Same thing with alcohol, but we could look at a number of industries where as the region becomes more prosperous, it is seen as a fruit ripe for picking. And of course, it's not just our consumption patterns, it's also our physical activity. So as we globalize, as we shift from an agricultural society or a manual society to one that is perhaps more office-based, that that our work, our lifestyles change, we become more sedentary. And this is just really a brief slide just to show that we need less calories in these changing lifestyles, and that as we tend not to consume less calories, there are health consequences as a result. Now, the health consequences are complex, and I certainly don't want to bombard you with slides, and there's certainly an endless number of them. But I just wanted to highlight a few things which I think is extremely important to understand in terms of how we make public policy in this region in the future. Now, in high-income countries, we already know that there's this shift going on in lifestyle. The impact in terms of disease burden is marked. So in high-income countries such as Australia, Singapore, and so on, what you see is a sharp rise in non-communicable diseases, cancers, diabetes, and all sorts of other conditions, which become the darker blue bar. They become the dominant pattern of disease. And there's lessons we can learn from that. When you look at other countries which are not quite far along in terms of the economic development, we tend to see a different pattern. We tend to see a lower rate of non-communicable diseases, But what we see also is kind of a double burden, an epidemiological double burden, where countries such as India and China and other countries are experiencing both NCDs and non-communicable diseases. And that's a period of transition that is a huge challenge for health policy. It's not all bad news, of course, and I always accused of that, so I'm going to put in this slide which really shows that there are benefits, health benefits from globalization, that we see, for example, a drop in maternal mortality rates across various subregions, some more so than others, but clearly this has interesting implications for what are we doing right and not just what we're doing wrong in terms of globalization. Now, with economic development comes always decisions about how to spend society's resources, and hopefully that pot of resources is growing. And there are many differences of opinion on how that pot should be spent, and how much in particular should be spent on health. Now, as I said earlier, health tends to get not a big voice, and alongside other potential areas to spend. And this is due partly for level of income, or partly level of wealth, partly population, but partly, or largely, I would say, also political. And you can see this graph really just shows that in different countries in the region, we have a huge difference in how much per capita is spent on health. We also have a very big difference in terms of how these resources are spent between public and private healthcare. And the balance between these two varies enormously across the region. And I think this is one of the core areas where we have to look at policy and ask ourselves, how does this balance affect access to healthcare and which populations? And it's an area which, again, is at the center of public policy choices. Now, again, a little bit of interesting or potentially positive news is that globalization and health are not mutually excluding. They're not mutually incompatible. So a good example is technology. And there's been a lot of hopes pinned on what's known as mHealth, using mobile technology in terms of leapfrogging some of the challenges that perhaps the low and middle income countries face in terms of diagnostics, in terms of treatment, and so on. So what people are predicting is that in Asia in particular, which has embraced mobile technology, that there are opportunities to develop much more quickly. Now, overall, the picture I'm presenting really is a picture of inequalities, that health in the Asian Pacific region is highly diverse in terms of its determinants and in terms of its outcomes. These are two equally lovely little boys, and if one of them happens to be born in Laos, where the life expectancy is much lower than in Japan, which is again world leading, that little boy will live to 82 years, opposed to the baby in Laos who will live to 56 years, which is a staggering difference in one particular region. What do we make of all this, I suppose, painting this picture? Well, in terms of this journal, I think what's the challenge for us is to try and stimulate a debate about governance, about the quality of governance, and about how we incorporate public health challenges within that debate. Now, governance to me is about steering, it's about trying to find collective ways of addressing society's challenges. And in the health sector, it's about finding ways to address some of these challenges that I described. In the economic sector, we have mechanisms in the region for governance. There's a debate about whether they are working properly, but compared to other regions, they seem to be performing a little better than other regions. In health, we have, as I say, the need for public health governance, and particularly, as just following on from Anne's presentation, global health governance. We have some big challenges ahead of us. So as I was describing earlier, globalization is creating this cauldron of challenges. As I try and illustrate here, there's whole sorts of things going on in terms of economic globalization, trade liberalization, the growth of transnationals, as we heard earlier this morning, urbanization, population movements, and so on. And these are leading to externalities, which again we've heard already, all sorts of health externalities, but of course wider externalities as well. Now at the moment, governance looks a little bit like this. It's about a big fish, and the big fish, I guess, is globalization and its problems, chasing a lot of little fish who are totally disorganized. And countries are pursuing these problems individually, and there's not a coordinated response. So I suspect in a few minutes, the big fish is going to be even bigger. What we need instead is some collective action. And that's what, to me, global health governance is trying to achieve, so that we have the big fish being chased by a very organized group of little fish. So in health, we have, of course, WHO, which Tiki has worked with for many years, and we know between us that WHO has its strengths and its weaknesses. And in terms of Asia, we even have 2 regions of WHO which deal with those issues. In terms of global health governance, beyond WHO, and there are many, many institutions that are involved in global health governance, and maybe there's an argument that maybe there are too many. But certainly we have the UN organizations, we have national governments, we have public-private partnerships, we have aid agencies, we have charitable trusts, we have NGOs, we have intergovernmental financial organizations, and we have private sector. This is building up a very complicated picture for public policy for global health. And the big question for us in the health field is, what is this going to look like? How are we going to actually turn all these little fish into an organized movement? So I'll just conclude by saying that I think there are some key questions that the journal could potentially address and encourage papers and research. The first is, what current and emerging patterns of health and disease do policymakers need to address in the region? Secondly, does Asia and the Pacific face distinct health challenges as a region in rapid transition? And are there lessons to be learned for other parts of the world? How can the region better contribute to effective health governance locally, regionally, and globally? And I think there are big questions there. And then getting back to the discussion this morning, and I see this very much as located within a bigger and probably the most important public policy debate we face in our generation: how can globalization be managed in a way that is least harmful to human and planetary health? Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Kelly. From the issues of food security to health, clearly there's a clear link to what Kim Anderson is going to speak about on population growth and especially in the Asian context. Kim is a professor of economics at the University of Adelaide as well as at the Crawford School of Public Policy. Kim, please.
Thanks, Dr. Van Gaster and Tom, for the opportunity to be at this inaugural conference. I hadn't thought about this topic until looking at these this morning and realising that what I'm talking about actually has a long history, starting with Crawford back in the 1950s, when he first saw the opportunities for Australia in Japan's growth and looked to build a bilateral relationship there. Peter Drysdale followed on from that work, and he led a project I was involved with back in the mid-80s, you might remember Peter, for somebody else who's in the Crawford School. There's Glenn Withers, who was running a EPAC at that time, looking at the implications of the newly industrialising countries' growth on the export prospects for countries like Australia. So today I'm looking at it from the same sort of point of view, but 2 decades later. So the key questions I was going to focus on are what's this rapid growth in what are natural resource poor Asian countries currently growing rapidly? What are the consequences of that for the global food markets, for the other primary product markets, and thereby for countries like Australia, New Zealand, and other resource-rich countries trading with them. And I was struck by the press of the last few just days really, or weeks, with this news coming from China that things are slowing down there, and suddenly everybody's worrying in Australia that we don't have a future there any longer. BHP's announcement to suspend development of Olympic Dam, for example, scaring people. But we can look at what the consequences would be if there was slower growth in countries like China and in India, and also think about the sources of that. And one of them might be, one of the consequences might be a slowdown in productivity growth in the primary sector in response to that, less R&D, for example. So let's see what that does for us. Now, this emerging Asia is not so much qualitatively different from what Sir John Crawford looked at in the 50s or Peter looked at in the 80s, but it's quantitatively different. And that's because even if you include Japan with those Asian NICs, they represented only 3% of the world's population. If you just look at China and India alone, they represent almost 40% of the world's population. And they're almost equally as densely populated as China's Northeast Asian neighbours. And so that means that if they are going to have a declining comparative advantage in primary production, both agricultural and mineral, that's going to matter far more than the earlier East Asian growth for global food and for global energy security, not to mention what it might mean for greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So the approach here is slightly more sophisticated than what we did in the 80s, Peter. If you remember, we were doing back-of-the-envelope type calculations almost, but we now have these global models of economy-wide models we can use. So this is a pretty simple one, but we've put a lot of energy into thinking about how you project forward such a model. We started doing this last year for the Asian Development Bank and the ADB Institute on a couple of projects they had about where world markets might be in 2030 and what role South-South trade might play and where China, India and ASEAN might sit in that. So we've aggregated that to 35 countries or country groups. We've taken account of something that Peter was stressing earlier, the importance of the Engel effect, the declining income elasticity of demand for food, and I'll talk a bit about the results from that a bit later. And we've looked at the best we can find consensus numbers on growth expectations throughout the world. ADB put a lot of effort into that last year as well, and taking population growth, looking at factor endowment changes, mostly increases, occasional decreases in the case of some land, agricultural land areas. And then out of that comes productivity growth rates, which are endogenous in this model because of the adding up conditions to make sure everything fits together. But we don't have it just a productivity for each economy. It's separated by sector with faster productivity growth in the primary sectors based on historical experience and slower productivity growth in services, again, based on experience relative to manufacturing. So we have this core simulation and we calibrate it to give us just slightly rising international prices for primary products. That contrasts with the 20th century when they declined at about 0.5% per year. Peter gave the numbers for rice. They were a bit over 1% if you take just that one product, or grains. That raises the question about what might one expect about primary product prices. Are they going to remain as high as they are now, which is very much higher than they've been for decades? It's anybody's guess, really. If you look at the IEA projections last year, they said that these energy prices would remain high and volatile, and then this year they put out a report on the prospects they saw, very rosy prospects they saw for unconventional gas production, which is going to put some downward pressure on those fuel prices, for example. And this is what the US government in their latest annual economic energy outlook conference or projection has for oil prices. You can see they haven't got a clue. It's going to be over a very wide range. And likewise on agriculture, the OECD and FAO jointly put out a report each year, and they too anticipate high and volatile food prices for the next decade at least. But that depends heavily on a huge number of things. One is biofuel subsidies and mandates. If they remain, that will put upward pressure there. They might even grow. That would put more pressure on it if more countries get into biofuel subsidisation, or they might die for other reasons. And if fossil fuel prices stay high, that's going to keep up the demand for biofuels if those keep growing. And then there's the question of what might happen to carbon taxation around the world. It seems like most countries are postponing decisions on that, but if they didn't, that would alter the outcome as well. So that's the picture of recent monthly prices for cereals and for food in general. And you can see those spikes we've seen that are putting prices way above what we've had over the last 2 decades. If you take a bit longer perspective, you can see that downward price for food in general, similar to Peter's graph for rice, with this recent upturn and the linking of it to fossil fuel prices. So in our projection, we take a sort of intermediate position between those two and have prices rising only slightly for these primary products in the core scenario, and then we explore a couple of other scenarios. And one is, what if growth rates in China and India, both their GDP growth and their capital growth, were to be somewhat lower, 1/4 lower than in these, slower than in these consensus projections that we have been using. And we also look at what would happen if, in addition to that, there was this slowdown in productivity growth in primary sectors, both agricultural and mineral, just to get a sense of how that might impact on prices. And it turns out the slower growth in China and India would tend to lower what would otherwise be the prices of primary products. But if there was a consequent slowdown in investment in productivity growth in primary sectors, and that could have the opposite effect and even overwhelm the first of those effects. So that's the summary of the prices we get out of this. The blue lines are the core scenario to 2030, not much change in relative prices across those 4 product groups. But if we have a slowdown in China and India, the red ones tell us we're going to get lower prices in these products. But if there was also a slowdown in primary productivity growth, primary sector productivity growth, you'd get the opposite effect, these green lines. And so the productivity story is a really big part of the story. And Peter gave us a paper yesterday, Peter Waugh, on Indonesia's investment in agricultural R&D, for example, and that can really have a big impact on the outcomes. That's a summary of our exogenous assumptions here. You might just note the assumption here, if I can find the little thing there. 6.2 is our average for developing Asia's GDP growth. You might think that's a bit high. That means like 7.9 for China, 7.1 for India, but we'd be dropping them back a couple of percentage points in that alternative scenario, which, and these are from a 2007 base before the rapid growth of the last 5 years in those economies. And so it's really quite a modest assumption about future growth compared with history. And you can see that from this graph. If you look at the red bars there, that's developing Asia's share of global GDP. And even if you just look at the 2 middle ones, between 2007 and 2012, there's been a big jump already. And so the jump to 2030 isn't all that large, really. So I think these are quite conservative assumptions about what will happen. What does it mean? It means developing Asia is going to become a very much larger part of the global economy in so many respects. And you can see several of them there. The second to last one, Peter, you might be interested to look at is the grain consumption one. You might say, why is Asia still growing its grain share of world grain consumption? And the reason is not because they're eating more rice or wheat, it's because they're putting a lot more stuff into feedstuffs that goes into livestock products, and so they still, as their incomes grow, consume something there. We've run these elasticities, income elasticities of demand right down to 0 for grains in this model. It makes almost no difference to this this line, because if you had them eating less grain by assuming an even lower income elasticity of demand, they just spend their income on more other products, including other food products, and when that's livestock products, that leads to increased indirect grain consumption. The last one there is fuel consumption. As you can see, they're going to double their share of world food consumption over this period. And most of the story is China. The darker lines here the China part of it, you can see it's more than half of the total story. This is just an enormous economy that's growing so rapidly that you cannot overstate the importance of what's happening there. And the short blip we're seeing at the moment is just going to slow that rate. Our assumptions would imply that over the next decades there's going to be slower and slower growth in China, and yet still it's going to be so large compared with the past from such a large base already that it becomes a very dominant part of the world economy. Now, how do we split this into resource-rich economies and others? Well, the first two columns there are the countries we use trade specialisation indexes to categorise as natural resource rich, and the others on the other side. So if we look at global exports, you can see developing Asia's share. These columns, so these rows add up to 100. Every second column of the rows, if you add them up, are 100. And so developing Asia doubles its share of manufacturing goods exports, even though the global share of manufacturers in total trade doesn't change. It actually shrinks a bit. So this is a hugely more important part of the world's manufacturing sector. And the consequence of that is a growth in the importance of the natural resource-rich countries in primary goods, so that their share of world trade in all goods jumps from 11 to 14%. So countries like Australia are going to become more important while ever this growth rate continues for these natural resource poor countries to our north. And that's the breakdown just of manufacturing, just to give you a sense of how important China would become in these scenarios for as a manufacturer in the world, overtaking Western Europe and North America and becoming what it was 150 years ago or so, when it was the world's biggest manufacturer back then. Okay, what does it mean for agricultural trade if we assume there's no policy changes? And I'll come back to that point at the end. But for the developing Asia's share of global agricultural and food imports, it's going to treble, rise from 15 to 40% in this scenario, and most of that is due to China, rising just from 4% back in 2007 to 27%. And so the natural resource-rich countries' share of global agricultural trade is going to increase by a third, go up from 34% to 41% by 2030. And you can see that there, this purple on the left is very small, and on the right it's the dominant chunk in there. If we assume there's no agricultural protection growth in China, that's how large it would become as a share of global agricultural imports. For non-agricultural primary products, the story is even more striking, but typically there isn't a policy response there, so if there is no limitation on imports of those products, China is going to become a major, very much bigger part of the world market for minerals and energy raw materials. Revealed comparative advantage obviously is going to alter as a consequence of this, and for Latin America you can see on the first two bars they grow their comparative advantage not only in farm products but also in minerals. Likewise for Australia. For sub-Saharan Africa it goes the other way. So even though they might have a lot of resources there, agricultural land and mineral resources, they aren't, according to these projections, able to outcompete what's happening in Latin America and Australasia. So for food security, of course, this is going to raise lots of questions, also for energy security, and many food deficit countries will simply focus on their food self-sufficiency ratio. We heard yesterday about how much China puts emphasis on that particular indicator. But of course, a better indicator of food security would be real household food consumption per capita, and even if you look at that at a national level, which this model can do, it gives you some sense of that, and ideally you'd want to look at it at the household level. But for food self-sufficiency, the red numbers are the critical ones. A 10 percentage point drop for China if there were to be no change in its current policies. And of course that would be, you can imagine how sensitive the Chinese government would be to that sort of fall. It's a little bit smaller in South Asia, only a 3 percentage point drop, and in sub-Saharan Africa a 2 percentage point drop. If we were to have slower growth, the third column there shows that drop for China will still be quite large. Even if it's a 1/4 reduction in its growth rate in China and in India, it doesn't alter that story for China. It does a little bit for India. It drops it back to where it was in the 2007 base. What does it do, though, for real household consumption per capita in each of these countries? Well, it turns out the growth story is most of it. Most of these countries all of these countries are going to get increasing consumption capability, and slower growth in Asia isn't going to slow that very much. The most important point from a global point of view, though, is that the biggest rises are where the greatest food insecurity is at the moment, namely in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and so that's a good thing from a global food security point of view, if this were the outcome. For bilateral trade, quickly, the natural resource-rich countries are certainly going to expand their share of world exports because of this increasing importance of the things they export, and their exports to China the share is going to treble. So if you just look at these data for developing natural resource poor Asia, that component of Asia of which the part in China is shown in brackets, you can see this trebling for each of these countries or more. For Australia, it's almost a trebling from 16 to 45% of all of our exports going to China. For the other regions, it's an even more striking one. For those of you watching what's happening in Vladivostok this week with the APEC meeting, you can look at what is projected here for Russia. And of course, if they start building more infrastructure like pipelines across to Japan for natural gas, that's going to even perhaps mean these numbers might be understated of the importance of Russia as a supplier and Central Asia to China, India, and China, Japan and Korea perhaps. Right, and so the share of exports to China there repeated on the first column. A bit of a slowdown is shown in the second column. What would happen if there's a slowdown in China and India's growth? That shrinks those numbers quite a bit, so that's how vulnerable we are to what might happen in that region. The final point, it's just an important caveat, which is throughout this we're assuming that current trade policies continue, but of course if there are greater concerns for food and energy security, many countries are going to reposition themselves as this Asian industrialisation proceeds. And for China especially, there's the question of whether they allow food self-sufficiency to fall. They probably won't. If you look at what's happened in the past 3 or 4 decades, both China and India have raised their rate of assistance to agriculture from very low negative numbers, like getting half what the world price would have been, through to a neutral point now. This is the relative rate of assistance on the vertical axis here, and per capita income on the horizontal. But you can see what happened to Japan, Korea and Taiwan in their agricultural protection growth over the past half century, and the question is whether China might do the same. So what does it look like? We've got a few years of data now. The OECD collects these PSEs, and that's the story for the past 15 years. So they're already on this path. They've doubled since 2004, their assistance to agriculture. It dropped, of course, in 2008 when the world prices spiked, but they're on a trajectory to assist, and they can do that quite a bit more within their WTO commitments at this stage. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.